In the spring of 1974, a crop insurance adjuster from the regional office in Emporia, Kansas, drove a company truck down a dirt road in Lyon County, stepped out into a field of winter wheat that had been hit by a late freeze followed by 3 weeks of standing water, walked maybe 40 yards in from the road, wrote a number on a clipboard, and told Nora Yancey that her field was a total loss. He said it the way adjusters say things, not unkindly, but with the practiced efficiency of a man who had said it before and would say it again before the end of the week. He told her she'd get a check. He told her the indemnity would cover most of her input costs. He told her she could plow it under and start planning for fall. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. Nora Yancey was 31 years old. She had 280 acres in Lyon County, Kansas, all of it paid for. She watched the adjuster's truck reach the county road, turn left toward Emporia, and disappear. Then she walked out into the field he had just written off. She walked the whole thing, not 40 yards in from the road, all of it. Every low corner and high ridge and drainage swale and the long sloping middle section, where the water had pulled the deepest and stood the longest, and where the adjuster had stopped and turned around and gone back to his truck. She walked for 2 hours in boots that came back caked to the knee. And what she found in that field was not what the adjuster had found, because she was looking at different things in different places with different eyes. Let me tell you about Nora Yancey, because what she did with that field only makes sense if you understand who she was and what she was carrying when she walked back out of it. Nora Evelyn Yancey was born in 1943 on the same 280 acres she still farmed in 1974. Her father was Clete Yancey, who had bought the place in 1931, which tells you something about Clete Yancey right there, that he was buying land in 1931 when men with more money and more sense were walking away from everything they owned. Clete had worked the year before as a soil conservationist for the county extension office, which was not a real title so much as a description of what he did, which was walk other people's fields and tell them what was wrong with their drainage and their tillage and their organic matter and their thinking. He'd been doing it without pay for 3 years before the county started paying him for it. He understood land the way some men understand engines, not from a textbook, but from accumulated observation over years of standing in the middle of fields and asking questions and staying long enough to hear the answers. Clete mapped his own 280 acres by hand. Not once. Every few years, after a wet spring or a dry summer, he'd walk it again and update his maps. He had notebooks going back to 1933, filled with observations about which corners drained first and which held water longest, and where the topsoil ran shallow over clay and where it went deep and dark and rich. He knew that the northeast quadrant of his south field had a subsurface clay lens at 14 inches that slowed infiltration and created a perched water table after heavy rain. He knew that the ridge along the western fence line shed water fast enough that it would show drought stress 2 weeks before the low ground did. He knew that the long middle section of his main field, on the section where the adjuster had stopped and turned around, was the last place to drain and the first place to show standing water, but that the soil under the standing water was some of the deepest and most productive ground on the property, and that if you could get it to drain, It would outperform the high ground by 30 bushels to the acre in a normal year. He taught Nora all of this, not in a classroom, in the field, walking, pointing, asking her what she saw, and waiting for her to answer before he told her what he saw. She was 8 years old the first time she walked a field assessment with her father. She was 12 before she understood what she was looking at. She was 16 before she could read a field the way he could. Not perfectly, but well enough that he started asking her what she saw first and listening to the answer. Cleet Yancey died in February of 1969. He left Nora the farm, the notebooks, and a savings account with $14,200 in it. He left her no debt. The farm had carried no mortgage since 1948. The equipment was old but paid for. The grain bins were aging but sound. He left her a note in his handwriting on a piece of lined paper that said, "Walk the whole thing before you decide anything. The road edge lies." She kept the note in the front cover of his first field notebook. Now, the field. When Nora walked back out of that standing water in the spring of 1974, she had her father's notebooks under her arm and a legal pad in her hand, and she had spent 2 hours doing what Cleet had taught her to do, which was look at the whole thing before deciding anything. Here is what the adjuster had seen. Standing water covering approximately 60% of the field surface. Wheat plants in the affected areas showing advanced crown rot and root death. Tillers collapsed. No viable recovery expected. Total loss, or close enough to it that the difference wasn't worth arguing about. That assessment was not wrong. It was just incomplete. It was the assessment of a man who had walked 40 yards in from the road and seen what the road edge showed him, which was the worst of it. Here is what Nora saw. The 60% the adjuster had written off was genuinely gone. She didn't argue with that. Crown rot was crown rot, but the northeast section, the section with the claylands her father had mapped in 1937, and again in 1951, and again in 1966, had drained faster than the rest of the field, not because of the clay, but because Cleet had installed a short run of tile drainage in that corner in 1954 that nobody remembered except Nora, because it was in his notebook on page 41 with a hand-drawn diagram and the notation 4-inch clay tile, 220 feet, installed November 1954, drains to the east fence ditch. The adjuster hadn't known to look for it. It wasn't visible from the road. It wasn't on any county map, but it had been quietly doing its work for 20 years, and the northeast corner had drained in the 3 weeks since the freeze while the rest of the field stood under water, and the wheat in that corner was stressed, but alive, and Nora estimated carefully, conservatively on her legal pad that she was looking at somewhere between 40 and 50 acres of wheat that still had a crop in it. She also saw something else. Along the western fence line, the ridge her father had noted for its fast drainage and its drought vulnerability. The wheat had survived the freeze and the wet both, because it sat high enough to drain and had enough cold hardiness built up before the freeze hit. That was another 12 acres, stressed, thin-standing, but alive. The adjuster had written off 280 acres. Nora Yancey was standing in the middle of a field that still had 60-some acres of wheat in it. She went home and she called the adjuster's office, not to dispute the claim. She was going to take the indemnity check. She had earned it The loss was real, and she wasn't leaving money on the table. But she told the woman who answered the phone that she intended to harvest what was still standing, and she wanted to make sure the adjuster's notes reflected that she had informed them, because she'd read her policy, and the policy said she could, and she wasn't asking permission. The woman said she'd pass the message along. Then Nora called her brother-in-law, Dale, who farmed the next section over and had a combine. She told him she needed to talk to him about custom harvesting 60 acres of wheat that the insurance company had just declared a total loss. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that she could hear him thinking about what to say. "Nora," he said, "that field is underwater." "Parts of it are," she said. "Come look at the rest." Dale came the next morning. He was a decent farmer and not a stupid man, but he was the kind of man who trusted what he could see from the road, and what he could see from the road was a field that looked like a pond. He stood at the fence line with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a while without saying anything. "Walk with me," Nora said. She took him to the northeast corner first. She showed him the tile drainage outlet at the east fence ditch, still running a thin trickle into the roadside ditch. She showed him the wheat. Thin, yes, stressed, yes, but standing. She showed him her father's notebook. Open to page 41. The diagram of the tile run, the date, the notation. Then she walked him to the ridge along the western fence line and showed him the wheat there. Then she stood in the middle of the field with him and let him look at both sections and do the arithmetic himself. "The adjuster walked in from the road and turned around," she said. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the northeast corner for a long time. "What do you figure for yield?" he said. 35 to 45 bushels on the tile section if we get 3 weeks of dry weather before heading. Maybe 25 to 30 on the ridge, conservative." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Your daddy put that tile in?" 1954, Nora said. Dale pulled his cap off and held it in his hands and looked at the field. "All right," he said. "I'll bring the combine." The 3 weeks of dry weather came. It didn't always in Lyon County in the spring, but it came that year, and the northeast corner dried down enough to carry equipment by the 3rd week of May. Nora walked the field again the week before harvest and revised her estimate upward. The tile section had responded to the dry weeks better than she'd expected. The plants had tillered out, the heads had filled, and she was looking at the high end of her range. The ridge section was thinner but consistent. Dale brought the combine on a Tuesday morning. He started on the ridge, which was drier and less risky for the equipment, and worked his way around to the northeast corner over 2 days. Nora walked behind the combine on the first pass and watched the grain flow into the tank and said nothing. She was not a woman who said much when things went the way she'd planned, because things going the way you planned was not, in her view, a surprise worth commenting on. It was the point. When Dale pulled the combine to the end of the last pass in the northeast corner and shut the engine down and climbed out of the cab, he walked over to where Nora was standing and looked at the cut field behind them. He had the yield monitor numbers in his head from the cab display, and he'd been watching them all day. "You want to know what I'm seeing?" he said. "Tell me," Nora said. 42 bushels on the tile section, 28 on the ridge. He paused. "On a field, the insurance company declared a total loss." Nora nodded. "That's better than my Northfield did last year," Dale said, "and I didn't have standing water." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. Let me tell you about what Nora did next, because this is where the story stops being about a field and starts being about something else. She deposited the indemnity check. It covered her input costs, as the adjuster had promised. Then she deposited the grain check from the harvest. Wheat was trading at $4.20 a bushel in Lyon County that June, and 62 acres at a blended yield of 38 bushels per acre came to roughly 2,356 bushels, which at $4.20 came to $9,895. That was grain from a field that had been declared a total loss. That was grain that, according to the official record, did not exist. She put it in savings. Then she started thinking about the tile drainage. Her father had put in 220 feet of 4-inch clay tile in 1954, and it had, 20 years later, saved 62 acres of wheat from a loss that took the rest of the field. She spent the fall of 1974 walking the south field with her father's notebooks and a soil probe and a hand level, mapping every low area and every drainage path, and every place where water stood longest after rain. She identified 3 additional sections of the field that would benefit from subsurface drainage. She got quotes. Perforated plastic drain tile had come down in price through the early 1970s, and a local contractor was doing installations for about $180 per acre for a complete drainage system. For her 3 target sections, about 90 acres total, that was $16,200. She didn't borrow it. She didn't apply for an operating loan or a federal drainage improvement loan or any of the programs the Extension Office was promoting that fall. She had $14,200 in savings from her father's inheritance and the $9,000+ from the grain check, and another $4,800 she'd accumulated over 5 years of careful operation, and she had enough to do it without a payment attached to it. The contractor installed the drainage system in October and November of 1974. Perforated 4-inch plastic corrugated drain tile at 40-foot spacing, running to a main collector line that daylighted at the east fence ditch, the same ditch her father's original tile had been running to for 20 years. The contractor told her she was one of the few farmers in the county doing drainage improvement that fall. Most people, he said, were spending their money on equipment. Grain prices had been good in 72 and 73, and people were buying tractors and planters and combines on credit, and the equipment dealers were having the best years they'd ever had. Nora thanked him and wrote him a check. If you have ever watched a community make one decision while one person makes a different one, and watched long enough to see which decision held, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one isn't over yet. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 7 years, because this is where the arithmetic becomes something you can feel. The drainage system worked the way drainage systems work when they're properly designed and properly installed on land that has been properly understood. The South Field, which had been producing inconsistent yields because of its drainage problems, began producing consistent yields. Not spectacular yields. Lyon County winter wheat in the mid-1970s was not a spectacular crop, but consistent year over year, without the wet year disasters that had plagued that field since Cleet had bought it in 1931. Nora's average yield on the South Field went from the high 20s to the low 40s over 3 years. Her input costs stayed flat because she wasn't replanting drowned sections or fighting the disease pressure that standing water brought. She was also watching her neighbors. The equipment buying that the tile contractor had mentioned in the fall of 1974 had continued through 1975 and 1976 and into 1977. New tractors, new combines, new planters. The dealers in Emporia were busy. The farm credit system was busy. Interest rates were manageable in those years, on part 7, 8%. And grain prices were holding, and the general consensus in Lyon County was that farming was finally paying what it was worth, and the way to capitalize on that was to scale up, buy more equipment, farm more acres, take on more debt, and let the good prices carry the payments. Nora watched this and said nothing. She was not a woman who told her neighbors what she thought of their financial decisions, but she kept her own ledger the same way her father had. And what the ledger told her was that every dollar she wasn't paying in interest was a dollar she could put somewhere else. By 1978, she had $31,000 in savings. By 1980, she had $47,000. She was farming 280 paid-for acres with paid-for equipment and a drainage system that was paid for, and her annual fixed costs were property taxes, fuel, seed, chemical, and the small repairs that old equipment always needed. Her variable costs moved with prices. Her fixed costs did not move at all because there were no payments attached to anything she owned. Then 1981 happened, and 1982, and 1983. You know what happened in the early 1980s in farming country. You know about the interest rates, prime hitting 21.5% in June of 1981, operating loans at 18%, 19% for farmers who had borrowed to buy equipment and land when money was cheap and grain was high. You know about the commodity prices, corn dropping below $2.50, wheat below $3.50, prices that didn't cover input costs for operations that were carrying debt. You know about the land values. Lyon County farmland that had been appraised at $800 an acre in 1979, dropping to $400 an acre by 1983, which meant that farmers who had borrowed against their land values to buy more equipment found themselves underwater on loans that the banks were suddenly very interested in calling. Nora's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there had never been anything borrowed. Her property taxes went up slightly. Her fuel costs fluctuated. Her seed and chemical costs held. She was farming the same land with the same equipment and the same drainage system. And the crisis that was dismantling farm operations across Lyon County was passing over her the way a storm passes over a building that was built for the weather. She watched it happen. Not with satisfaction, that's not the right word, and it wouldn't be honest to use it. She watched it with the quiet sadness of someone who had understood what was coming and had been unable to say so in a way that would have been heard, and who now had to watch people she knew lose things they had worked for because they had built those things on borrowed money. Dale lost his north section in 1982. Not the whole farm, but the north section he'd bought in 1977 on a land loan at 9% that had been refinanced into a variable rate instrument that hit 16% in 1981. The bank took it. He kept the home place, but the north section went to auction. Nora was at that auction. The north section was 160 acres of decent Lyon County ground, not as well drained as her south field, but workable, with a small equipment shed and access to the county road on two sides. The opening bid was $280 an acre. A farm management company out of Wichita bid it to $310. A land speculator from Johnson County bid it to $340. The farm management company went to $355. The Johnson County man went to $370. Nora bid $380. The farm management company went to $390. The Johnson County man dropped out. Nora went to $400. The farm management company paused for long enough that the auctioneer had started the countdown, and then they dropped out too. 160 acres at $400 an acre. $64,000 total. She wrote a check. The crowd at that auction was not large. Distress auctions in 1982 didn't draw crowds the way equipment auctions did, because nobody wanted to be seen celebrating a neighbor's loss. But there were 30 or 40 people there, farmers and bankers, and the farm management company representative and the Johnson County speculator, and a few people who had come the way people come to those things, not to buy, but to witness. When Nora wrote the check, the auctioneer looked at it and looked at her and didn't say anything. The farm management company representative looked at her. Dale, who was standing at the edge of the crowd because it was his land being sold, and he hadn't known what to do with himself but hadn't been able to stay away, looked at her. Nobody said anything for a moment. Not the rearranging everything you thought you knew kind of silence. The standing in the presence of something you hadn't accounted for kind. Dale walked over to her after the paperwork was done. He had his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the ground for a moment before he looked at her. "That was my daddy's north section," he said. "I know it," Nora said. "You're going to farm it right," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to put drainage in the low corner," she said. "Your daddy never got to it." Dale nodded slowly. He looked out at the field. "You knew," he said, "in '74 when everybody was buying equipment, you knew what was coming." "I knew what the ledger said," Nora said. "I didn't know about the interest rates. I just knew I didn't want payments." He nodded again. Then he said, "Your daddy would have done the same thing." "He taught me to walk the whole field," she said, "before I decided anything." Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Cleet Yancey would have understood without a word of explanation. Nora farmed 440 acres through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. She put drainage in the low corner of Dale's old north section in the fall of 1982. The same contractor, the same system, perforated plastic tile at 40-foot spacing running to a main line at the east fence. It cost her $8,100 for 45 acres. She paid for it out of operating income. She never carried a loan on the expanded operation. She updated her father's notebooks. She had her own now, running parallel to his, the same format, the same hand-drawn field maps, the same notations about drainage and soil depth, and organic matter and what each corner did in a wet year versus a dry one. She had a niece named Carla, her sister's youngest, who started spending summers on the farm when she was 12. Carla had the same quality Nora had recognized in herself at that age, which was that she would rather understand how something worked than be told what it did. By the time Carla was 15, she was walking field assessments with Nora, the way Nora had walked them with Cleet. Nora gave her the soil probe and let her read the cores and waited for her to say what she saw before she said anything herself. One afternoon in the summer of 1989, they were walking the south field, the field the adjuster had written off in 1974, now producing 45 bushels an acre in a normal year. And Carla stopped in the middle of the tile section and looked at the wheat, and then looked at the field map she was carrying, which was Nora's update of Cleet's original 1937 map. And she said, "This is the section the insurance man said was gone." "It is," Nora said, "and Grandpa Cleet's tile saved it." "His tile drained it," Nora said. "The wheat saved itself. The tile just gave it the chance." Carla thought about that. But the man from the insurance company didn't walk far enough to see it. "He walked far enough to see what he expected to see," Nora said. "That's a different thing." Carla wrote that down in her notebook. She had her own notebook by then. Nora had given it to her at the beginning of that summer, the same kind Cleet had used, and told her to start at the beginning and write down everything she saw, and not to write down what she expected to see. In 1991, Nora was invited to speak at the Lyon County Farm Bureau annual meeting. She was not a public speaker, and she did not consider herself one, and she almost declined. But the county agent who called her said that a lot of younger farmers were trying to figure out what the 1980s had meant and what they should do differently, and he thought she might have something useful to say. She went. She stood at the front of the room with a legal pad and spoke for about 12 minutes. She didn't use notes. She talked about the south field and the adjuster and what her father had put in the ground in 1954 and what it had done in 1974. She talked about the drainage investment and why she'd paid for it with savings instead of a loan. She talked about what the ledger had looked like in 1981, when the rates hit 21% and her fixed costs hadn't moved. She talked about Dale's north section and what she'd paid for it and what she'd done with it since. Then she said something that the county agent told her later he was still thinking about 3 years after the fact. She said, "The adjuster wrote off my field because he walked in 40 yards and saw standing water and wrote down what he saw. He wasn't wrong about what he saw. He was wrong about what he didn't see. And I think most of the decisions that got people into trouble in the late 1970s were the same kind of decision. People looked at grain prices, and they looked at interest rates, and they looked at their neighbors buying equipment, and they wrote down what they saw. They weren't wrong about what they saw. They just didn't walk far enough in." The room was quiet when she finished. Not the way rooms go quiet when someone has said something they disagree with. The way rooms go quiet when someone has said something they already knew but hadn't been able to say out loud. Dale was in the back of the room. He had come, Nora thought, because he needed to hear it said out loud by someone who had been standing in the same county when it all happened. When she walked past him on the way out, he put his hand out and she shook it. "Your daddy would have said the same thing," he said. "He did say it," Nora said. "He just said it to me in a field when I was 8 years old." "Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a field that's standing under water in a wet spring?" "Most people see a loss. An adjuster sees a form to fill out. A banker sees collateral that isn't performing. Nora Yancey saw 62 acres of wheat that nobody had bothered to walk far enough to find. And under it she saw the thing her father had put in the ground 20 years before she needed it. And under that she saw a way of thinking about land and money and risk that would let her buy her brother-in-law's north section with a check while everyone else was selling. The adjuster said the field was a total loss. He pulled 40 yards of information and made a county-wide decision. Nora walked the whole thing the way Cleet had taught her to, and pulled 40 bushels they never counted from ground they'd already written off. That's the difference between someone who reads the road edge and someone who reads the field.